Imagine for a moment that you are stepping into a quiet room at the end of the day. The light is soft. The outside world seems to have dimmed a little, and for the first time in hours you can clearly hear your own thoughts. That inner murmur that is usually buried under noise, obligations, and other people's expectations. And right there, this message appears, not as a mechanical coincidence, but as a precise meeting with the inner moment you are going through, as if something inside you already knew that a reorganization is taking place, that one chapter is slowly beginning to close while another prepares to open without dramatic announcements, without fireworks, only with a subtle sense of inner movement, of silent change that still has no clear shape, but already has direction. And it is exactly in this space that Neville's teaching comes alive, not as theory, but as a living experience built from the way you think, feel, and perceive yourself in every small daily gesture. Before we go on, I want to invite you to write this sentence in the comments. I am ready to hold my new version. Because when you consciously express an intention, you not only organize your mind, you also reinforce an inner commitment that helps stabilize the process of change, and the comments also create a collective field of focus that strengthens the energy of the channel and allows more people to find this kind of content when they need it. If you feel that this space brings you clarity and depth, consider supporting the channel through Super Chat in a collaborative way, so this type of content can continue to grow and reach more people with the same quality and dedication. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep accompanying this transformation process with new content that goes deeper and deeper into consciousness, identity, and inner creation. Now allow your attention to settle here, as if you were sitting in front of an open window, observing not the outer landscape, but the inner movements that usually go unnoticed. Because Neville always reminded us that life does not change from the outside in, but exactly the opposite. That every experience that manifests is a direct consequence of the inner state a person consistently inhabits, not what they occasionally desire, not what they affirm for a few minutes, but the emotional and mental identity they sustain, even when they are not consciously thinking about it. Many people believe that change happens when something external finally resolves, when an opportunity appears, when someone responds, when a situation unlocks. But in reality, the true turning point happens much earlier, in the moment the mind begins to relate to itself in a different way, when the inner narrative stops revolving around lack, urgency, or struggle, and starts stabilizing into a more natural sense of sufficiency, coherence, and inner calm. It is like when a messy room first gets organized in the mind before the hands move a single object, and suddenly one day you realize the space feels different, lighter, clearer, even if you still can't point to exactly what changed first. Neville explained that imagination is not fantasy. It is a creative function of consciousness that shapes the way the nervous system interprets reality, and that when a person learns to imagine from a stable emotional state, without anxiety or tension, they begin to train the body and mind to inhabit a new inner normal, and that inner normal, over time, becomes external experience without the need to force results. Notice how many times in your life you have tried to change something through effort, pressure, or fear that it wouldn't happen, and how that same inner state created more rigidity, more exhaustion, more of a sense of pushing against something invisible. Real change does not feel like a fight. It feels like a gradual reorganization of how you perceive, decide, and emotionally respond to what happens. You start to notice that you no longer react the same way to certain situations, that some worries lose intensity, that certain decisions become clearer without so much inner conflict, and those small signals are the real indicators that a new state is beginning to consolidate within you. Neville invited people to honestly observe their inner dialogue, not to judge it, but to understand which identity they are feeding every day without realizing it. Because identity is not an abstract label, it is a living pattern of thoughts, emotions, expectations, and micro-decisions that repeats automatically. When that pattern begins to soften, when it becomes more flexible, more coherent, more aligned with a quiet sense of trust, outer life inevitably begins to reorganize to reflect that new balance. It is not magic. It is systemic coherence. It is the way consciousness expresses itself through experience. Imagine a person who for years lived in an inner state of defense, always anticipating problems, always expecting obstacles, always tightening the body without noticing, and little by little learns to inhabit a state of greater presence, greater inner softness, greater emotional clarity. Even if externally there are still no big visible changes, the way they walk, speak, choose, and relate, is already planting a new trajectory that will inevitably bear different fruits. This is the kind of transformation this message seeks to activate, not as a spectacular promise, but as a deep, silent, sustainable process built from the inside out, respecting the natural integration rhythms of the body, mind, and emotions. And that is precisely why this type of content does not try to accelerate anything, but rather helps you recognize the inner movements that are already happening, so you can accompany them with more awareness, less resistance, and greater inner coherence, allowing the new version of you to become not just an idea, but an experience that consolidates day by day, thought by thought, choice by choice, as a new way of inhabiting your own life that becomes more and more natural, more stable, and more authentic. And as this new way of inhabiting your life begins to stabilize, the way you interpret time also changes, because you no longer live it as a constant race toward a future result, but as a sequence of inner adjustments that integrate progressively, almost imperceptibly, like when the body slowly adapts to a new posture and one day you realize there is no more pain, no more tension, that something reorganized without the need for struggle. Neville insisted that the human mind tends to underestimate these micro-changes because it is trained to look for big events, dramatic turns, obvious signs, but true transformation usually appears first as a feeling of greater inner coherence, less contradiction between what you think and what you feel, less conflict between what you desire and what you allow yourself to receive. You begin to notice that your inner dialogue becomes kinder, less reactive, that you no longer need to constantly justify your decisions to an inner critical voice, that the body responds with more relaxation, deeper breathing, a more stable sense of presence, and all of this is valuable information indicating that a new state is being incorporated by your inner system. Many people believe they must feel constant enthusiasm or euphoria to confirm that they are changing, but Neville explained that more mature states feel surprisingly simple, natural, almost ordinary, because they are no longer loaded with emotional tension and integrate as a new inner normal. It is like learning to drive. At first, everything requires attention, effort, fear of making mistakes, but over time the body integrates the movement and the mind is freed for other layers of awareness. In the same way, when a person stabilizes a new inner state, they stop thinking of it as something they must actively sustain and begin to live it as part of their everyday identity. Observe how you respond to small setbacks, delays, silences, uncertainties, because that is where it becomes most clear which state you are truly inhabiting, not the one you wish for, but the one you spontaneously express. If a small obstacle makes your body tense, your mind rush, and your emotions contract, it indicates that a pattern of control or insecurity is still operating. But if little by little you begin to respond with more flexibility, with an inner pause, with a gentler capacity to adapt, that shows a new balance is emerging. Neville spoke about the importance of not fighting against old mental habits lies in the understanding that struggle only strengthens them, while allowing them to reorganize naturally makes space for a new internal identity to become more attractive, more stable, more functional for your well-being. Authentic change is not imposed. It is seduced. It consolidates itself because it offers an inner experience that feels more coherent, more livable, more harmonious. Imagine a person who for years defined themselves through scarcity, urgency, the feeling of never being enough, and who slowly begins to experience moments of greater confidence, deeper calm, clearer decision-making. Even if not everything in the external world is resolved yet, their inner system is already learning to live from a different place, and that learning creates a new invisible trajectory that, over time, becomes visible in opportunities, relationships, choices, and outcomes. Consciousness does not separate the inner from the outer. It simply organizes experience according to the predominant state that is being sustained. That is why Neville invited people to cultivate a more conscious relationship with imagination, not as a form of escape, but as a way of training the nervous system to become familiar with more stable states of well-being, coherence, and quiet confidence. When you imagine from calmness, from naturalness, from the sense that something is already possible without urgency, the body registers that experience as a valid reference and begins to reorganize how it responds to the environment. Little by little, decisions start to align more intuitively. Opportunities are recognized more clearly. Relationships adjust more organically, not because you are controlling every step, but because your perception has become finer, steadier, more coherent with your new internal identity. This process is not linear. There are moments of integration, moments that feel like stagnation, moments of review, but every phase plays a role in consolidating the new state. Patience is not passivity. It is an understanding of the natural rhythm of living systems. Just as a muscle needs time to adapt to a new load, the mind and emotions need time to stabilize a new pattern of identity. Neville often reminded that rushing the process usually generates resistance, anxiety, and an artificial sense of control that ends up weakening inner coherence. When a person learns to trust progressive adjustments instead, they develop a much deeper stability, a confidence that does not depend on immediate results, but on the internal experience of coherence, presence, and clarity. At that point, life begins to feel less like a sequence of problems to solve and more like a continuous dialogue between your consciousness and the experiences you encounter, a dialogue that becomes increasingly creative, flexible, and aligned with what you truly wish to express in the world. As this inner dialogue refines itself, you begin to realize that many of the limitations that once seemed external were actually habits of perception, automatic interpretations, internal narratives that are now losing strength, leaving space for a broader, freer, more conscious way of inhabiting your own experience. And when you start living from that inner spaciousness, something very subtle yet profound shifts in the relationship you have with yourself. You no longer need to constantly monitor yourself. You are no longer endlessly correcting, pushing, demanding that something change immediately. Instead, a quiet trust in the process emerges, an inner sense that movement is already happening, even if it has not yet taken visible form. And that trust changes the way the body breathes, the way thoughts organize themselves, the quality of attention with which you observe your daily life. Neville explained that consciousness is always expressing itself, even when we believe we are stuck, because even stagnation is an active state that communicates an identity, an expectation, a way of relating to experience. When that identity begins to soften, when the mind stops defining itself exclusively by what is missing or by what has not yet happened, an inner space opens where new possibilities can be perceived without tension. It is not that the external world magically changes overnight. It is that your perception becomes capable of recognizing options that were previously invisible, because the internal filter did not allow them into awareness. Many times life is already offering small signals of reorganization, small movements, encounters, ideas, intuitions, but when the mind is rigid, anxious, or hyper-controlling, those signals go unnoticed or are quickly dismissed because they do not match the exact expectation the person had. When the inner state softens, perception becomes more receptive, more curious, less defensive, and this opens a natural channel of cooperation between consciousness and experience. Neville insisted that imagination should not be used as a mechanism to escape reality, but as a way of educating inner sensitivity, of familiarizing the nervous system with more stable states of well-being, coherence, and naturalness. When you imagine from a calm place without urgency or tension, you are not trying to convince the mind of anything. You are allowing the body to experience a new emotional reference, a new sense of internal normality, and that reference begins to influence how you interpret what happens around you. It is a silent training, almost invisible, yet deeply transformative, because it changes the base from which decisions are made, events are interpreted, and expectations are built. Over time, you begin to notice that you no longer react in the same way to situations that once triggered fear, insecurity, or conflict, that there is a greater capacity to pause, a kind of inner space between stimulus and response that allows you to choose more clearly instead of reacting automatically. That space is one of the clearest indicators of the maturity of consciousness, because it is where inner freedom truly manifests. Neville used to say that real freedom is not doing whatever one wants externally, but not being enslaved by one's own inner automatisms, by old patterns of thought and emotion that condition experience without being noticed. As that inner space stabilizes, life starts to feel less reactive and more participatory, as if you are dialoguing with experience rather than fighting it or running from it. A growing sense of coherence appears between what you think, what you feel, and what you do, and that coherence generates a stability that depends less on external circumstances and more on the inner relationship you have with yourself. This does not mean that challenges, doubts, or uncertainties disappear, but that your capacity to move through them changes. becoming more flexible, more creative, less dramatic. You begin to trust your own adaptability, your emotional intelligence, your inner sensitivity to read situations more clearly. Neville spoke often about the importance of not idealizing change, because idealization creates unrealistic expectations that later generate frustration, while authentic change usually feels simple, gradual, integrated, like a natural maturation of the inner system. Many people look for intense experiences, strong emotions, or dramatic external signs to validate that they are changing. But in reality, the deepest changes show up as greater inner simplicity, reduced conflict, and a stronger sense of alignment with oneself. It is like a lake that stops being agitated and becomes calm, allowing the reflection to become clearer, steadier, more defined. That calm is not the absence of life. It is a more organized form of inner movement. When you reach that level of internal organization, you start noticing that your choices are more coherent, your boundaries clearer, your desires more authentic and less conditioned by external expectations. You no longer need to compare yourself as much. You no longer feel the same need to prove or constantly validate your worth through external results, because there is a more solid inner base from which you relate to the world. Neville explained that identity is not a fixed label. It is a living process that is continuously built and adjusted based on the inner experience a person predominantly inhabits. When that identity becomes more flexible, more conscious, more emotionally stable, the field of possibilities you naturally perceive expands, not by forced willpower, but because your perception is no longer limited by the same restrictive filters as before. You begin to allow yourself to imagine broader scenarios, more coherent decisions, healthier relationships, not as unrealistic fantasies, but as natural extensions of your new way of being with yourself. That inner permission is one of the most powerful shifts that can occur in a person, because it unlocks a more fluid relationship with life, learning, mistakes, and personal evolution. Inner rigidity tends to generate fear of error, fear of change, fear of losing control, while conscious flexibility generates curiosity, openness, and greater tolerance for uncertainty. Neville reminded that uncertainty is not an enemy. It is the space where the creativity of consciousness can manifest as long as the inner system is not dominated by fear or urgency. When you learn to inhabit uncertainty with greater calm, without the constant need to control every outcome, something very natural begins to unfold inside you, a quiet confidence that life can reorganize itself intelligently when you remain present, coherent, and internally available to what wants to emerge. With each result, you develop a deeper trust in your ability to respond to what life presents, and that trust becomes a stable source of inner security. Over time, this inner security shows up in the way you communicate, in how you set boundaries, in how you choose your commitments, in how you distribute your energy, in how you relate to your own thoughts and emotions. Life begins to feel less chaotic and more coherent, not because everything becomes perfect, but because your relationship with experience becomes more organized, more conscious, more mature. This kind of transformation has no final endpoint. It is an ongoing process of refining awareness, adjusting identity, expanding perception, and each stage brings new levels of understanding, new challenges, and new opportunities for integration. Neville saw this process as a progressive education of imagination, attention, and emotional sensitivity, an education that does not happen in a single moment, but through the daily practice of observing yourself, listening to yourself, and adjusting with patience and honesty. Every small moment of presence, every conscious choice, every inner pause you introduce into your day contributes to consolidating a new pattern of identity that, over time, becomes stable and natural. There is no need to rush because consciousness grows the way a living organism grows, through adaptation, integration, and continuity, not through external imposition. And as this growth consolidates, you begin to experience a kinder relationship with yourself, a greater capacity for emotional self-regulation, increasing clarity in your priorities, and a deeper sense of inner coherence that inevitably reflects in the quality of your outer experience. This is the kind of change that does not need to be proclaimed, because it is lived, embodied, and expressed quietly in every daily gesture, in every small decision, in every way you respond to the world, and it is precisely there that true transformation begins to take real form in your life. And when that inner coherence starts to become a stable foundation, Your relationship with effort also changes, because you no longer feel the need to push life to make things happen, nor to constantly prove that you deserve to move forward. Instead, a more organic sense of collaboration with experience emerges, as if movement arises from the inside out, without excessive friction. Neville explained that much of human exhaustion does not come from action itself, but from the inner tension with which that action is performed, from the constant struggle between what a person desires and what they internally believe is possible or permitted for them. When that inner gap begins to close, when identity becomes more coherent with authentic desires, vital energy stops being scattered in internal conflicts and organizes itself more efficiently, generating a sense of greater vitality, clarity, and presence. You begin to notice that you do things with less resistance, that decisions flow more naturally, that even mistakes are integrated with more learning and less self-attack. This inner softening is not weakness. It is a more intelligent way of relating to experience because it allows consciousness to adapt more quickly and with less wear and tear. Neville observed that when a person stops defining themselves by struggle, by lack, or by the need for control, they begin to discover inner layers of creativity, intuition, and flexibility that were previously blocked by constant tension. It is like releasing a dammed river. The energy does not disappear, it simply begins to flow more harmoniously, finding new channels, new forms of expression, new opportunities for expansion. In this state, your relationship with others also changes, because you no longer relate from defense, comparison, or the need for validation, but from greater presence and authenticity. You listen better. You express your limits more clearly. You choose more consciously where to invest your time and energy, and this creates more balanced relationships with less unconscious conflict. Neville said that the way you relate to yourself is always reflected in the way you relate to the world, and when that inner relationship becomes kinder, more coherent, and more conscious, the environment naturally begins to reorganize to reflect that new balance. This is not about controlling others or manipulating circumstances, but about allowing inner coherence to act as a silent organizing principle of experience. Many people try to change their lives by modifying only external factors, changing places, jobs, relationships, or superficial habits. But if the inner identity remains the same patterns tend to reproduce themselves in new forms. True sustainable change happens when identity is re-educated, when the inner system learns to inhabit more mature states of responsibility, clarity, and emotional stability. Neville emphasized that conscious imagination is powerful precisely because it allows you to rehearse internally new ways of being, without waiting for circumstances to change first. When a person allows themselves to internally experience a sense of security, coherence, and wholeness, even while external challenges still exist, the nervous system begins to register that experience as a valid reference, and little by little reorganizes its response to the environment to align with that new reference. This process does not happen abruptly. It happens through repetition, familiarity, and gradual integration, like any deep learning. Just as the body learns to maintain balance by walking, falling, and adjusting, consciousness learns to sustain new states through the daily practice of attention and inner adjustment. Over time, those states stop feeling artificial or forced and become a new inner normal. At that point, many behaviors that once required conscious effort become spontaneous, natural, almost automatic, because they are no longer fighting against an opposing inner pattern. Life begins to feel less fragmented and more integrated, less reactive and more creative. Neville reminded that there is no real separation between what a person consistently imagines and the way their experience organizes itself, because imagination, when sustained with emotional coherence, acts as a structuring principle of perception and action. It is not a fantasy disconnected from reality. It is a way of training the mind to recognize and inhabit broader possibilities. When this capacity develops in a mature way, a person stops using imagination to escape the present and begins to use it to enrich their relationship with the present, to open space for new interpretations, new responses, and new decisions more aligned with deep well-being. This conscious use of imagination also strengthens resilience, because it allows challenges to be reinterpreted not as absolute threats, but as opportunities for learning, adjustment, and expansion. You begin to see mistakes as information, obstacles as feedback, unexpected changes as invitations to reorganize internally rather than as signs of failure. This reconfiguration of perception is one of the most important pillars of inner growth because it determines the emotional quality with which you move through life. Neville said that the mind is always interpreting experience, and that when those interpretations become more conscious, they can be refined to create a healthier relationship with yourself and with the world. As this refinement consolidates, anxiety tends to decrease, clarity increases, the capacity for concentration strengthens, and a more stable sense of inner direction emerges, not as a rigid goal, but as a living orientation that adjusts with experience. Life stops feeling like a series of random events and begins to be perceived as a continuous dialogue between your consciousness and the circumstances you encounter. This dialogue is not always comfortable, but it becomes increasingly meaningful, coherent, and aligned with your growth. And it is in this ongoing process of adjustment, integration, and expansion that true transformation consolidates, not as a single event, but as a new way of inhabiting your own existence with greater presence, responsibility, and inner freedom. And when you look back after moving through this process of inner adjustment, you realize that the most important change was not a specific external circumstance, not a particular result, not a single answer that came from outside, but the way you learned to relate to yourself, the way your inner dialogue became more honest, more stable, more conscious, the way your body learned to inhabit less tension and more presence, the way your mind stopped constantly anticipating threats and began to perceive possibilities with greater clarity. Neville reminded that human consciousness is not designed to remain static, but to expand, integrate, and mature through experience, and that each stage of growth naturally brings a reorganization of identity, priorities, perceptions, and choices. When you allow this process to unfold without forcing it, without idealizing it, and without resisting it, you discover that life begins to respond with greater fluidity, not because the world has become perfect, but because you have become more internally coherent, more capable of sustaining what arrives, more flexible in the face of change, more aware of your own inner movements. Real transformation does not eliminate uncertainty, but it makes you more skillful at navigating it. It does not eliminate challenges, but it gives you greater clarity in responding to them. It does not eliminate complex emotions, but it allows you to integrate them without losing stability. You begin to live with a deeper sense of inner responsibility, not as a burden but as freedom, because you understand that your experience is intimately linked to the quality of the states you inhabit and the attention you cultivate in everyday life. This understanding does not impose itself as an intellectual belief. It gradually becomes embodied in the way you walk, the way you listen, the way you choose, the way you rest, the way you speak to yourself when something does not go as expected. And it is in this silent embodiment that Neville's teaching finds its true strength, not as an external promise, but as a constant invitation to live from a more conscious, coherent, and authentic identity. You may not be able to point to a single moment when everything changed, but you will be able to recognize that something essential reorganized within you, that your relationship with life became clearer, more stable, more alive, and that this new way of being with yourself will continue to expand naturally, accompanying you through each new stage, each new decision, each new learning, as a solid inner foundation from which to keep building your own path with greater presence, freedom, and inner coherence.